my claim is that meat industries are harmful to the environment. When it comes to global warming, hamburgers are the Hummers of food. It can be seen that meat, something that is considered to be a part of our diet today and once a luxury meal, is actually something that is harmful to our environment. The way we produce meat can be partly to be blamed. The once traditional agriculture is now being replaced by the use of harsh chemicals, dependency on large amounts of land usage, and consuming precious non-renewable resources daily. As a consumer of meat, I have no indication of giving up meat so easily, and many of you will not either. However, one may take this bit of information useful and think about passing on that oozing double western for a Prius salad instead. Okay. First claim is that the meat industry is one of the biggest contributors to the rise of global warming. In 2006, the United Nations report found that the meat industry produces more greenhouse gases than all SUV cars, trucks, planes, and ships in the world combined. So what does that mean? Say, eating 1 pound of meat emits the same amount of greenhouse gases as driving an SUV 40 miles, according to the Environmental Organization. So let's take one of these gases. Let's take, for example, methane. With billions of farm animals, such as cows or chickens, being crammed into these factories, they produce enormous amounts of methane during the time of digestion and excretion. Why is methane so deadly? It's as 20 times as more powerful than carbon dioxide, trapping heat into the atmosphere. With that said, these harmful gases is currently responsible for at least 25% of the world's carbon dioxide emissions, 60% of methane gas emissions, and 80% of nitrous oxide. Due to harsh chemicals that are being used in these industries, there is an increase in air and water pollution levels. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency blames these farming factories that are responsible for 70% of the pollution in the nation's rivers and streams. Animal waste, feces, and other harsh chemicals from factories are washed away through these rivers and streams, eventually hitting the ocean. These harmful chemicals and animal waste that comes in large amounts from factories eventually cause dead zones, which are parts of the oceans where there's no oxygen almost, so there's no life in certain parts of the ocean. Take, for example, the Gulf of Mexico. There's a dead zone which is like half the size of Maryland. In 2006, the EPA provided new loopholes, as they call it, to make it more accessible for animal factories to continue polluting the water and air. This is getting so bad that in places such as fish farms, male fishes are starting to grow ovaries, as West Virginia and Maryland scientists soon discovered, and that these can be resulted from the farm factories from chicken feces containing harmful drugs. The amount of excrement as dust, bacteria, molds, fungi, and feces are released as toxic gases into the air. EPA reported that 80% of these emissions come from animal waste alone. It is not just these floating dust or bacteria, but factory farms which spray liquid waste into the air, which also contributes to that high percentage. The industrial agriculture used too much of the Earth's natural resources. A highly noted environmental magazine wrote that more than 1/3 of all fossil fuels produced in the U.S. are used to raise animals for food. Factories are required mass amounts of energy to grow food for the animals as well, thus sending these crops to get to the factories and spend even more energy, including gas and the use of diesels, to get to the destination. Operating the factory itself, taking the large amounts of animals taken into the slaughterhouse, where animals are skinned, taken apart, and then sent to processing plants. From there, energy is spent from taking the processed food to the grocery stores. Energy is constantly being used until the consumers buy them. According to the Environmental Health Perspective, it takes 5,000 gallons of water to produce 1 pound of meat, when growing only 1 pound of wheat only requires 25 gallons of water. So to conclude with that note, one can see that the tremendous effect of these meat industries and how they are harmful to our environment. Maybe skipping meat every so often may not seem so bad after all. Thank
All right, the proposition is clearly stated at the beginning. There's no setup of the structure in a preview. We do get a little bit of background information. You've got very clear signposting of the supporting structure while you're going through the argument, so it's pretty easy to follow with an exception that I'll explain in just a second. I thought you explained the assumptions of the issue for the most part reasonably well. They were fairly clear. Your supporting information, there are a couple of examples. There's a couple of statistical things. I sometimes get some statistics on which there is not much explanation on, and the source citations are a little bit problematic. For instance, you say, one highly regarded environmental magazine, and I don't know what that is. That seems to be a little vague. There's a couple of biologists that are cited at one point, but they don't cite any of the reasons why they've reached the conclusions that they do. It's just kind of conclusionary there. I think the link on the biological changes due to fecal matter in the water, I think, is a little strained. You need to develop that a little bit more. The dead zone that you mentioned, for instance, in the Gulf, I think, well, where did you hear about this? What? You say it's the size of Maryland. Well, then somebody's written about it, and I don't get a source citation on that. I've never heard of it before. That doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, but it does mean that I'm going to need some proof on it more than just your say-so. And you've got, I know you didn't make it up, so it had to come from somewhere, and we're not getting source citations for that kind of information. I think that there sometimes is a problem with sufficiency. One or two general pieces of information are used to accept a conclusion, and I think you need to get a little bit more in depth on some of those things. I think you could have picked any one of the supporting claims and turned that into your argument and developed it in some depth, and it would work a little bit better. The presentation is what hurts you a little bit on some of these other issues. For instance, although you have a clear statement of the proposition and you provide us with some background information, your voice drops off frequently, you lose the impact of your humorous story at the beginning because you're doing so much reading. It sounds like you're rushing through the presentation. You need to speak up sometimes. It's not so much that it's hard to hear, but you don't sound like you're speaking with much conviction, and so your ethos, your credibility is largely undermined there. All right, thank you.